Before we jump right into the stories, I just want to take the time and thank you for allowing me the opportunity to hopefully aid you in your sleep. This video is designed to be as minimalist as possible, with only a black screen, myself, and, of course, most importantly, you. So, if this video has helped you in your sleep, please let me know down in the comments below. I really want to know if I'm doing something right. I truly am passionate about storytelling, and I really can't express my appreciation enough. Enjoy. It was a stormy night in late October, the kind of nights where the rain taps relentlessly against the windows, and every gust of wind sounds like a whisper. I was home alone, a rare occurrence, since I usually had roommates bustling about, but they were all gone for the weekend. With a book and a cup of tea, I tried to enjoy the solitude. My small, cozy living room was dimly lit, the lamp casting long shadows that danced with the flickering of the candles. The storm outside seemed to grow more intense, and I felt a creeping unease. As I curled up on the couch, I noticed something peculiar through the rain-streaked window. It was a figure standing across the street, barely visible in the dim street light. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow or a tree swaying in the wind, but it wasn't moving with the wind. It was stationary, and it seemed to be looking directly at my house. I tried to dismiss it as a curious passerby, but the figure's persistent stillness unnerved me. The rational part of my mind urged me to ignore it, but curiosity and fear mingled in an unsettling cocktail. I couldn't just sit there. With hesitant steps, I approached the window. Peering through the curtains, the figure was still there, a dark silhouette against the night. I couldn't make out any features, but I felt its gaze piercing through the darkness, watching me. I stepped back, heart racing, and decided to call my friend, hoping their voice would calm my nerves. No answer. I tried another friend, then another. Each call went to voicemail. The feeling of isolation was suffocating. The power flickered, then went out completely, plunging me into complete darkness. My phone's light was my only source of illumination. As I grabbed my phone for the flashlight and checked the locks on the doors and windows, everything was secure, but the sense of being watched just grew stronger. I dared another glance outside. The figure was closer now, standing at the edge of my yard. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its intent gaze. I began to panic. As I dialed for the police, my voice trembling as I explained the situation. They promised to send someone over, but the storm was causing delays. As I waited in the dark, the feeling of being watched intensified. Then, I heard a faint tapping, not at the door, but on the window. The tapping grew louder, more insistent. I shuddered, unable to move as the tapping turned into a rhythmic pounding. Suddenly, the front door rattled. I froze, expecting the worst. But then a voice called out. It was the police. Relief flooded through me as I rushed to the door, glancing back at the window. The figure was gone. The police searched the area but found no one. They suggested it might have been a homeless person seeking shelter from the storm, but I knew it was more than that. The intensity of the gaze I felt couldn't have been a mere prank. After they left, the power came back on, and my friends finally called back, their voices a comforting balm. I didn't sleep much that night, jumping at every sound, every shadow, and in the morning I found footprints in the mud outside my window, confirming that someone had indeed been watching me. I never saw the figure again, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. That night changed something in me. The comforts of my home felt violated, and the shadows seemed to hold secrets. I knew that the world had mysteries and dangers hidden in plain sight, and sometimes they come a little too close for comfort. Working as a food delivery driver, I've seen my fair share of odd customers and strange places, but nothing compares to what happened one winter night. The air was crisp, and the city was alive with the usual hum of nightlife. I was on my last delivery of the night, eager to finish up and head home. The address was on the outskirts of the city, a part of the town I was less familiar with. The GPS led me down a series of narrow, winding streets until I reached what looked like an old residential area. The houses were spaced far apart, most of them dark, giving off a vibe that they hadn't been lived in for a while. The house in question was at the end of a cul-de-sac, shrouded in darkness. No porch light, no street lights, nothing. I double-checked the address, thinking maybe I'd made a mistake, but it was correct. With a sigh, I grabbed the food and made my way to the front door. Something felt off right from the start. The air was eerily still, and the house seemed to loom over me, its windows like dark, watching eyes. I rang the doorbell and waited. No response. I rang again, and this time I heard faint footsteps inside. The door creaked open, revealing a dimly lit hallway and a figure standing just beyond the light's reach. The person, a man from what I could tell, didn't say a word. He just stood there, staring. I announced the food delivery, trying to keep my voice steady. The man mentioned for me to come in, but I insisted on staying at the door. There was something unsettling about him, the way he moved, or rather, didn't move. Reluctantly, he stepped forward into the light, and I saw his face, pale, expressionless, with eyes that seemed to look right through me. He took the food, his hand briefly touching mine, ice cold and clammy. As he did, he muttered something under his breath, something I couldn't understand. As he took the food and retreated back into the shadows of the house, I heard a noise upstairs. It sounded like a muffled cry, desperate and scared. My heart started racing and every instinct told me to run. But then the man reappeared, standing at the door, watching me. His gaze was unnerving and almost predatory. I backed away slowly, not wanting to turn my back on him. Once I reached my car, I glanced back. The door was still open, and the man was gone. But the feeling of being watched remained. I got into my car and sped away, not stopping until I reached a well-lit area. I never found out what was in that house or who that man was. I reported the incident to the police, but they didn't find anything unusual. I quit the delivery job soon after. The memory of that night, the feeling of those cold, lifeless fingers, and the unexplainable fear still haunts me. It was a delivery I wish I'd never taken. I remember it like it was yesterday, although I wish I could forget. It was a chilly autumn evening, and the sun had just dipped down below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. I was driving back from a late shift at work, looking forward to a quiet night at home. As I drove down the winding country roads, my headlights cutting through the gathering fog, I noticed something odd. There was a car parked on the side of the road, hazard lights blinking weakly in the dimming lights. It wasn't uncommon to see a broken down car out here, but something felt off. The car was an old, rusted sedan, its windows so grimy that you couldn't see inside. Driven by a mix of curiosity and concern, I pulled over a few feet ahead of the sedan. I got out of the car and the cool air biting at my skin and approached the vehicle cautiously. I called out, asking if they needed help, but there wasn't any response. The silence around me was oppressive, the usual sounds of wildlife eerily absent. I hesitated for a moment before peering into the sedan through its dirty window. What I saw made my blood run cold. The car was empty, except for a single old-fashioned doll sitting in the passenger seat. Its glossy eyes seemed to stare right at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Unsettled, I quickly returned to my car, eager to put some distance between me and that abandoned vehicle. But as I started my car and I looked in the rearview mirror, I froze. The doll was no longer in the sedan. It was sitting in the middle of the road, its head tilted as if it was watching me. Panic surged through me and I floored the accelerator, desperate to get away. As I sped down the road, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every shadow seemed to move. Every noise made me jump. After what felt like hours, I finally reached my house. I raced inside and locked the door behind me, trying to convince myself that whatever I had just seen was just my imagination running wild. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. That night, I barely slept, jumping at every creak and groan of the house. In the morning, I convinced myself that it had been a figment of my tired mind. But when I stepped outside, my heart stopped. There, on my front porch, was the doll from the sedan, its glossy eyes staring up at me. I don't know how it got there or what it wanted, but I knew I couldn't stay. I packed a bag and left, vowing never to return. To this day, I still don't know what really happened that night, or what the doll was, but sometimes, late at night, I swear, I can hear the faint sound of a child's laughter, and I'm reminded of those glossy, unblinking eyes watching me from the darkness. It all started as a dare. My friends and I, always seeking thrills, I decided to explore the city's tallest abandoned building. We were adrenaline junkies, but that night, I wished we had chosen a different adventure. We arrived at the decrepit building, its windows like hollow eyes staring into the night. The door was unlocked, a silent invitation. Inside, our laughter echoed off the peeling walls, our flashlights casting eerie shadows. We climbed flights after flights of stairs, aiming for the roof to see the city lights. Reaching the top, I pushed the door to the roof open. The view was breathtaking. The city spread out like a sparkling ocean. My friends wandered to the edge, but I hung back, suddenly uneasy. That's when I heard the door slam shut. Turning, I saw the rusted lock had fallen into place. We were trapped. Our phones had no signals, and our shouts for help were swallowed by the vast urban expanse. Hours passed, and the initial excitement turned to fear. The night grew colder and a sense of dread settled over us. It wasn't just the situation, it was the building itself. It felt alive, watching us with unseen eyes. We tried to break the door, but it wouldn't budge. As the night deepened, so did our despair. My friends huddled together, but I felt a growing urge to walk around. That's when I noticed the other door, partially hidden in the shadows. It was slightly ajar, leading to a narrow, dark staircase. Driven by a mix of hope and fear, I convinced my friends to follow me. The staircase was steep, spiraling down into darkness. We descended, the air growing colder, the silence thicker. Suddenly, slipped. Tumbling down the stairs, I hit my head and blacked out. I awoke to silence. My friends were gone, and the staircase had vanished. Panic surged through me. I stumbled around the dark until I found a small, windowless room. Huddled in a corner, I waited for what felt like an eternity. Finally, as the first light of dawn crept in, I heard footsteps. Rescuers had come. They led me out the building. Outside, I learned the horrifying truth. My friends had never made it out of the building. The authorities said they fell trying to find another way down. The building was demolished shortly after, but the memories still haunt me. I often wonder what happened in that darkness, and why was I the only one who made it out. The city lights don't look the same anymore. They remind me of that night, the night we were trapped on the rooftop, and the unspeakable horror that followed. It was a late October evening. The trees were bare, casting eerie shadows in the dim streetlights. That's when I decided to take a shortcut through the park to get home. Usually, the park was peaceful, but that night, it felt different. The rustling leaves seemed louder, and the darkness felt thicker. As I walked, I noticed a group of people ahead, gathered around a bench. They were laughing and talking loudly. Something about them seemed odd, but I shrugged it off as just a bunch of friends hanging out. As I got closer, they went quiet, their eyes following me. My heart started to race. I quickened my pace, trying to look confident. One of them, a tall figure in a dark hoodie, stepped in front of me. He asked if I had the time, his voice smooth but with an underlying menace. I glanced at my phone and mumbled the time, attempting to sidestep him. But that's when another person blocked my path. They were forming a circle around me, and their faces were obscured by the darkness. Panic set in. I remembered reading somewhere that in situations like this, it's always best to make noise or cause a scene. So, I yelled. I told them I didn't want any trouble, but my voice sounded small and shaky. They just laughed at me, and the tall figure stepped closer. He told me that they were just having a bit of fun, his breath reeking of cigarettes, though. I could see now that there were 5 of them, all wearing hoodies and jeans. Their ages were hard to determine. I weighed my options. Running seemed impossible, and fighting was out of the question. I tried to reason with them, but my voice was trembling. I just told him I wanted to go home. I begged him. That's when suddenly headlights cut through the darkness. A car was approaching, its engines loud in the quiet park. The group exchanged looks and, without a word, dispersed into the night. I stood there, shaking, as the car slowed down beside me. It was a police patrol, checking the park as part of their routine. They asked if I was okay, and I nodded, unable to speak. But they were so kind to offer me a ride home, which I graciously accepted. That night, I laid in bed, unable to sleep. I kept replaying the encounter over and over in my mind. I realized how quickly things can go wrong, how important it is to be aware of your surroundings, and how sometimes help can just come at the right time. From then on, I avoided taking shortcuts, especially at night. The memory of those strangers and their haunting laughter lingered with me, a chilling reminder of what could have been. It was a chilly December evening, the kind where the wind seems to whisper through the trees. I was working late at the office, the last one there as usual. The building was an old, creaky structure on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense woods. It always gave me the creeps, especially at night. I was finishing up some reports when I heard a faint tapping sound. It was rhythmic, like someone tapping their fingers on a window. I tried to dismiss it as the wind, but the sound persisted, growing louder and more insistent. Feeling a mix of curiosity and dread, I stood up and walked towards the window. Peering outside, I saw nothing but the dark, sprawling woods. The tapping stopped. I shook my head, telling myself it was just my imagination, and returned to my desk. That's when the lights flickered and went out, plunging me into complete darkness. The only light was the dim glow of my laptop screen. I felt a surge of panic but tried to remain calm. I grabbed my phone to use it as a flashlight and made my way to the circuit breaker. The hallways were eerily quiet. The only sound was my own footsteps echoing off the walls. When I reached the circuit breaker, I flicked the switches, but nothing happened. The power was out. I decided it was time to leave. I didn't like the idea of being alone in a dark, silent office building. I grabbed my things and headed for the exit. That's when I heard it. A soft, dragging sound, like someone pulling something heavy across the floor. It was coming from the other end of the hallway. This is when my heart began to race. I thought about running, but something compelled me to investigate. As I moved slowly, my phone's flashlight leading the way, the sound grew louder. When I reached the corner, what I saw made my blood run cold. There, in the dim light, was a man dragging a large, heavy bag. He was dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by a hood. Our eyes met, and a chill went down my spine. There was something deeply unsettling about this gaze that he was doing, something inhuman. I backed away slowly, not wanting to turn my back to him. The man didn't follow. He just stood there, watching me. I didn't wait to see what he would do next, so I turned and ran as fast as I could towards the exit, slamming the door behind me. Outside, the cold air hit me like a wave. I didn't stop to catch my breath. I got into my car and drove away, not stopping until I reached the safety of my home. The next day, I reported the incident to the police, but they didn't find anyone in that building. There was no sign of a man or the bag. To this day, I don't know who that man was or what he was doing in that building, but I never stayed late in the office again. And sometimes, late at night, I can still hear that soft dragging sound in the back of my mind. It's a reminder that sometimes true horror lies in the unknown, in those moments where reality seems to slip into the realm of nightmares. It was a few years back, during a summer that was particularly sweltering. I had taken a job as a night security guard at an old warehouse. The place was in a secluded area far from the city center, surrounded by overgrown woods. The warehouse itself was huge, mostly empty, with long, echoing corridors and vast, dimly lit storage rooms. My shift started at 10 p.m., just as the last rays of sunlight vanished. That night, like any other, I settled into my routine, a sweep of the building, checking the locks, and then monitoring the security cameras. The stillness of the place was unnerving, but I chalked it up to the usual jitters of working alone at night. It wasn't until around midnight I heard a noise. a kind of shuffling sound coming from one of the storage rooms. I figured it was probably a rat or something, but protocol demanded that I checked it out. I grabbed my flashlight and made my way to the room. The moment I stepped inside, I felt a chill. The room was colder, far colder than the rest of the building, which was odd given the summer heat. Shining my flashlight around, I saw nothing out of the ordinary, just rows of dusty shelves and old crates. But then, my light caught something, footprints in the dust on the floor, leading back to the room. They were fresh, human-sized. My heart started pounding as I noticed I wasn't alone. I followed the footprints to a small hidden door at the back of the room. It was slightly opened. Cautiously, I pushed it open further and found a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. Every instinct told me to turn back, but I had to know. I descended the stairs and the air grew colder with each step. At the bottom, it was a small, dimly lit room, and there, huddled in the corner, was a man. He was disheveled with wild eyes, and he looked up at me with a mix of fear and relief. He told me he'd been hiding there for days, running from someone. He was incoherent, his story fragmented and confusing. I didn't know what to make of it. I led him upstairs, intending to call the police, but as we emerged into the main hall of the warehouse, I saw the front door open. I had locked it earlier. My heart began to sink, and I realized again we weren't alone. We heard footsteps, slow and deliberate, coming from the dark hallway. I grabbed the man's arm and we hid behind some crates. The footsteps grew louder and closer. Then they stopped. There was a long, tense silence. I peeked out and saw a figure standing there, barely visible in the dim light. The figure started moving towards us, and in a split second I decided to act. I lunged at the figure, catching them off guard. We struggled, and in the chaos, the intruder's mask came off. It was a woman, her eyes filled with a mix of shock and rage. The police arrived soon after. It turned out the man I'd found was a missing person, and the woman had been his captor. She was part of a group involved in some shady activities, using the warehouse as a hideout. I was just a random obstacle in their plan. I quit the job soon after. The whole experience just left me shaken, a reminder of the darkness that can lurk in the most unexpected places. Every so often, I think back to that night and wonder what might have happened if I hadn't decided to check on that noise. It's a memory that I wish I can forget. I never believed in the supernatural or anything of that sort. I was a realist, always looking for a logical explanation. That was until the night I saw him, the man with the mutilated face and an unnaturally large smile. It started subtly. I had moved into a small, cozy apartment in a quiet part of the city. The place had a quaint charm, and the rent was affordable. Life was ordinary until I began noticing odd occurrences. At first, it was just the feeling of being watched, especially at night. I brushed it off as paranoia, a side effect of living alone. Then, one night, I woke up feeling uneasy. The room was silent, the kind of silence that screams. That's when I saw him, standing in the corner of my room, a man, tall and gaunt, his face horribly mutilated. His most striking feature was his smile, wide and grotesque, stretching unnaturally across his face. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to scream or move. He just stood there, watching me with unblinking eyes. As the sun rose, he vanished. I thought it was a nightmare, a figment of my imagination, but every night he returned, always watching, always smiling, that horrific smile. I couldn't sleep, I couldn't eat. My life spiraled into chaos. I searched the answers, dug into the history of the apartment, but I didn't find anything. Driven to the brink, I set up a camera to record my room at night, desperate to prove I wasn't losing my mind. The next morning, I played the footage, and sure enough, there he was, clearer than ever, watching me as I slept. But this time, the camera caught something else, a faint, almost inaudible whisper. I strained my ears and finally made out the words. He was asking for help. That, that changed everything. I realized he wasn't there to harm me. He was just trapped, probably in pain. From that night on, I no longer feared him. I would wake up and see his smile and whisper back that I would try. I moved out eventually, but I never forgot him. The silent, mutilated man with the haunting smile. Sometimes in the dead of night, I still feel his presence, hear his whispers, and I wonder, was he a ghost, a figment of my stressed mind, or something else entirely? I remember this story like it was yesterday. It was a typical busy weekday, and I was working late at the office, trying to finish a project. The building was nearly empty, and the silence was almost deafening. I was alone in my cubicle, focused on my computer screen, when I heard a faint, unusual noise. It sounded like a soft scraping sound coming from somewhere nearby. I paused, listening intently, but the sound stopped as abruptly as it had started. I shrugged it off as probably just the building settling and went back to work. After a few minutes, though, the noise started again, but this time it was accompanied by a distinct feeling of being watched. I looked around, half expecting to see a colleague playing a prank, but there was nobody there. The empty office suddenly felt a lot more sinister. I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. Deciding that a quick walk might help shake off the feeling, I left my cubicle and headed towards the break room. The office was eerily quiet, and the only sound was the soft hum of the air conditioning. As I neared the break room, I noticed that the door was slightly ajar. That was odd. I was sure it had been closed when I passed by earlier. Pushing the door open, I peered inside. The break room was empty, but something felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it, but the air felt heavier, and there was a faint, almost imperceptible smell, like old, damp wood. I quickly made a cup of coffee, trying to ignore the growing sense of dread. On my way back, though, to my cubicle, I heard a scraping noise again. This time it was more louder, more deliberate. My heart started to really beat out of my chest, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. I picked up my pace, almost jogging back to my desk. When I sat down, trying to calm myself, telling myself it was all in my head, the unthinkable happened. I felt a cold, clammy hand gently rest on my shoulder. I froze, every muscle in my body tensing. I was too scared to look back, too scared to move. The hand, it felt real, too real to be a figment of my imagination. My mind was racing, tried to rationalize what was happening, but fear was quickly taking over. After what felt like an eternity, I gathered the courage to turn around, and to my utter shock, nobody was there. The hand had vanished as if it had never been there. I was alone, yet the feeling of being watched was more stronger than ever. At that moment, I knew I had to leave. I grabbed my things and practically ran out of the office, not stopping until I was outside, under the streetlights, surrounded by the sounds of the city. I didn't look back, and I didn't return to the office that night. I later learned that the building had a history of unexplained occurrences, stories told in hushed tones by the older employees. They spoke of shadows that moved on their own, whispers in empty rooms, and a presence that lingered in the halls. I don't know what I experienced that night. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, or maybe there was something else, something unexplainable lurking in that office. But one thing is for certain, I never stayed late at that office again. It was just another night in my small town, working late into the night on my project. That's when I first heard the tapping at my window. Thinking it was just a branch or an animal, I ignored it. But the tapping persisted, growing louder and more noticeable. I tried to shrug it off, focusing on my work. However, something about the sound made me uneasy, like it wasn't just random. It felt intentional. Days passed, and the tapping became a nightly occurrence. I tried to find its source, checking outside during the day, but found nothing. My sleep became restless, and I started feeling watched. One evening, I decided to confront whatever it was. As the tapping started, I flung open the window, but there was nothing there, just the cold, empty night. That's when I heard the sound of something moving in my house. I panicked. I searched every room, but found no one. Yet, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. I couldn't shake the thoughts that something was in my house with me, unseen but ever present. I started to avoid being home at night, but the thought of unseen visitors haunted me wherever I went. After weeks of this torment, I decided I had enough. I set up a camera to record my room at night. What I saw the next morning chilled me to my bone. The footage showed me asleep in bed, and then a shadowy figure emerging from my closet. It watched me for hours before disappearing back into the darkness. I couldn't stay there any longer. I packed my essentials and left the house that day. I never found out what that figure was or what it wanted. Sometimes at night, I still hear a faint tapping at my window, but I never dare to look. I've moved on, but the memory of that unseen visitor lingers, a reminder of the unexplainable horrors that might lurk in the shadows of our seemingly ordinary lives. As the evening sky draped itself in the darkest of blues, I found myself walking home alone. An unusual quietness accompanied me that night. The city's pulse had slowed, and even the persistent hum of traffic seemed to have taken a breath. I've always enjoyed these walks. They gave me time to think, time to unravel the thoughts that cluttered my day. The beginning of my journey was uneventful, though, marked only by the rhythmic tapping of my shoes against the pavement. Streetlights cast long shadows that danced around me, and a cool breeze whispered through the leaves, a natural symphony for my solitary concert. Then, midway through my path, an odd sensation prickled at the back of my neck, a feeling that I was not entirely alone. At first, I dismissed it as a trick of the mind. After all, the night has a peculiar talent for painting phantoms in every corner. But as I continued, the feeling persisted, growing stronger, and turned into an unnerving certainty that someone was watching me. I quickened my pace, stealing glances over my shoulder. That's when I noticed a silhouette, distant yet distinct, a form that seemed more intense than the rest of the shadows. It moved when I moved, paused when I paused. That's when my heart began to race, the casual stroll turning into a silent march of terror. As my home came into view, a sanctuary of lights and warmth, the silhouettes seemed to close in. My mind raced with escape plans, should this follower prove to have sinister intentions. I thought of screaming, running, anything to deter what I now perceive as a threat. When I reached my door, I fumbled with the keys, never daring to take my eyes off the figure. As I slipped inside and locked the door behind me, I peered through the peephole. The street was empty. The figure, the peculiar creep who had followed me, was now gone, as if they were just a figment of my imagination. Yet, for nights after, I would hear sounds just outside my window, a soft tapping that could be branches, or could it be fingers? I never saw the silhouettes again, but the feeling of being watched never entirely left me. I was a prisoner in my own home, jumping at shadows, and the creep, or whoever that was, or whatever that was, I left a permanent mark on my psyche. I've always been a bit of a loner, preferring the company of books, so when I inherited a remote cabin from my late uncle, I saw it as a perfect retreat. Nestled in dense woods, it was the ideal place for solitude, or so I thought. My first few days were peaceful, filled with reading and walks in the woods, but one evening as dusk settled, I felt an inexplicable unease. The forest, usually alive with sounds, fell eerily silent. I shrugged it off as paranoia, a city dweller not used to the wilderness. But the next few nights, the strange things began to happen. I would wake up to find objects moved or missing. One morning, in fact, my food supplies were scattered all over the kitchen floor. I thought maybe an animal had gotten in, but there were no signs of forced entry. Then came the whispers, soft and unintelligible murmurs that seemed to float in from the woods at night. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind, but deep down, I knew it was something else. The whispers grew louder each night, more insistent. One night, fueled by a mix of fear and curiosity, I decided to investigate. I grabbed a flashlight and headed into the woods. The trees seemed to close in around me, the darkness suffocating. The whispers grew louder, guiding me deeper into the forest. Suddenly, I stumbled upon a clearing. In the center stood a dilapidated old wooden house. It looked centuries old, forgotten by time. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a chilling silence. I felt a presence, as if something or someone was watching me. I approached the house, my heart pounding in my chest. The door creaked open at my touch, revealing a room shrouded in dust and cobwebs. Then, I saw them. Photographs, hundreds of them, covering the walls. They were all of me, some taken from a distance, others up close, even some from within the cabin. I ran back to the cabin, packed my things, and left that night. I never returned to the cabin. And I never found out who was in that house or why were they watching me. The experience left me a bit shaken, constantly looking over my shoulder. To this day, I still hear whispers at night, and I wonder if it's just the wind or something more. The forest, once a place of peace, now haunts my dreams. The cabin and the old house in the woods remains a mystery, one I'm too afraid to solve. It was a typical Friday evening, and I had the house to myself. My family was away for the weekend, and I relished the thought of some quiet time. I decided to spend my nights in the usual way, a little bit of reading, some gaming, and maybe even a late night movie. The weather outside was a bit dreary, a soft patter of rain gently tapping against the window, only adding to the solitude of the night. As the evening wore on, however, I noticed a slight unease settling over me. It wasn't anything tangible, just a vague sense of discomfort. You know, like the feeling you get when you think you've forgotten something important. I shrugged it off, though, thinking it was just a storm that was making me unsettled. I went to the kitchen to make some popcorn, and that's when I first saw it, a fleeting shadow outside the window. It was just a blur, probably a tree branch swaying in the wind, I thought. But something inside me tightened. I peered into the darkness and saw nothing unusual, deciding I was just being paranoid. So I went back to the living room. Hours passed and I found myself engrossed in a movie. The unease from earlier had almost faded away when I heard a faint scraping sound, like something brushing against the house. I paused the movie, listening intently, but the sound didn't repeat. Just as I was just about to resume the film, a flash of lightning illuminated the room, and in that brief moment, I saw a figure standing outside the window. A person, just standing there, watching. My heart raced, and I blinked, and in the darkness that followed, the figure was gone. After just one blink, I told myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the light. But the sense of being watched was now undeniable. I moved slowly to the window, my hands trembling slightly as I peeked through the blinds. There was no one there, just the rain-slicked streets and the occasional flash of lightning. Trying to calm my nerves, I checked all the doors and windows, ensuring they were locked. Every small noise seemed amplified in that quiet house, and I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. I decided to turn off the lights and pretend to sleep, hoping that if someone was out there, they'd think I'd gone to bed. Probably a bad idea, but can't really think when you're that afraid or that scared. As I laid on the couch, my eyes was wide open, straining to hear any sound. Time seemed to stretch on endlessly. Then I heard it, a soft tapping at the window. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't dare move. The tapping continued, slow but deliberate. Gathering every ounce of courage, I decided to confront this situation. I switched on the porch lights and flung open the front door, ready to face whoever or whatever was out there. But the porch was empty. But on the wet ground, I saw footsteps leading away from the house, disappearing into the night. The realization hit me like a wave. Someone had indeed been watching, but now they were gone. I never found out who it was or what they wanted, but for the rest of that night, I couldn't shake the feeling of eyes being on me, watching from the shadows. It was my first week working a night shift at the old gas station off of Route 9. The place was empty, surrounded by dense woods. and the nearest town was a good 15 minutes away. I needed the extra cash, though, and night shifts just paid better. The job seemed simple enough: man the counter, restock when needed, and handle the occasional late night customer. This gas station, however, was a relic from the 70s, so it had its flickering fluorescent lights and a constant hum from the old refrigerators. My shift started at 10 p.m., and by midnight, the silence was my only company. I spent most of the time on my phone, occasionally glancing up at the monitors, but no one was ever there, just empty fuel pumps. It wasn't until around 2 a.m. where things got a little bit weird. A battered sedan pulled in. The engine sputtered as it came to a stop. Out stepped a man, average in height but with a presence that filled the room. He wore tattered clothing and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. It wasn't that, though. It was his smile that caught my attention. It was wide. It felt forced, unnatural, stretching ear to ear in a grotesque manner. He walked up to the counter, still smiling at me. His eyes, I noticed, were unsettlingly wild and intense. He asked for a pack of cigarettes, his voice as raspy as it can be. As I turned to get them, I felt his gaze piercing through me. When I turned back, he was closer, leaning over the counter. His smile never wavered. He asked me if it was a quiet night, and his breath, it smelled of decay, making me very kind of nauseous. I told him, yeah, it usually is, and I tried to sound casual, but I knew he sensed the fear in me. There was an unnerving feeling in my gut. I handed him his cigarettes, hoping he'd leave quickly, but he didn't leave. He just lingered, talking about random things like the weather and how empty the gas station is, and how easy it would be if things were to happen out here without anyone noticing. This is when I started to feel really uncomfortable and a huge red flag. Then he leaned in closer, his eyes boring into mine, and he whispered. He asked me if I ever wondered what it's like to not be found. The smile still plastered on his face. I really wanted to run, but I was just frozen. As when headlights appeared in the parking lot, a couple of teenagers pulled in, laughing and being loud. As when the man straightened up and his smile finally faltering, he tipped his hat at me and walked out, his departure as eerie as his arrival. After he left, I locked the door and called the police. They arrived quickly, but found no sign of the man or his car. The officers did mention, however, that there had been a few reports of a creepy guy bothering people at night, but it was never anything concrete. I didn't stay for the rest of my shift. I couldn't shake off the image of his smile and the evil in his eyes. The next day, I quit my job. I couldn't bear the thought of encountering him or someone like him again. This encounter with that stranger left a lasting impact on me. The isolation, the vulnerability of the night shift, and the man's haunting smile just lingered in my memories. It was a good reminder of how unpredictable and frightening the night can be, especially when you're not alone. I've always been an avid hiker, drawn to the serenity and challenges that nature has to offer. So when I heard about the Blackwood Forest, a local spot known for its dense woods and calming atmosphere, I couldn't resist the urge to explore it. My friends warned me about the rumors surrounding the forest, strange noises, eerie feelings, and tales of the hikers who never returned. But I shrugged them off as mere superstitions. It was a crisp, sunny morning when I set out. Equipped with my backpack, water, and a sense of adventure, I entered the forest. excited for a day of solitude and exploration. The dense canopy of trees filtered the sunlight, creating a dim, serene ambience that I found oddly comforting. Birds chirped, and the rustle of leaves underfoot provided a rhythmic soundtrack to my journey. As the day progressed, the atmosphere began to change. The once friendly chirps of the birds turned into unsettling silence. The air grew colder, and a sense of unease started to creep over me. I tried to shake off the feeling, attributing it to the emptiness and the chilling stories I heard from earlier. That's when I stumbled upon it, an old abandoned cabin, half swallowed by the forest. It looked like it hadn't been touched in years, with the wood rotting and covered in moss. My curiosity got the better of me, though, and I decided to take a closer look. Inside, the cabin was dark and dusty, with remnants of what looked like hasty departures: a broken chair, a rusty knife, and old, yellowed newspapers. A sudden noise startled me, though, a thump from the upper floor of the cabin. My heart raced. I was sure I was alone, but now I wasn't so certain. I called out, but no response. Deciding it was best to leave, I turned to exit, but as I did, that's when a door slammed shut, plunging me into complete darkness. I began to panic. I fumbled for my phone, using it as a makeshift torch. When I turned on the flashlight on my phone, the light revealed unsettling drawings on the walls, symbols I couldn't recognize, but that filled me with an inexplicable dread. I heard the thump again, and of course, it was closer this time. I didn't want to find out what was causing it, so I managed to pry the door open and bolted from the cabin, my breath coming in rapid gasps. The forest, once welcoming, now felt like a labyrinth, the trees like silent sentinels watching me. I ran, not knowing if I was being followed, but the fear of what might be behind me is what propelled me to keep moving. After what felt like hours, I finally emerged from the forest, the sight of my car in the distance bringing me a wave of relief. I drove home, the events at that cabin replaying in my mind. Later that night, as I tried to convince myself it was all just a product of my imagination, I decided to do some research. What I found chilled me to the bone. The cabin, it turned out, had a history. A hiker had disappeared there years ago, never to be found. The symbols on the wall were part of a ritual. According to local legend, it meant a trap of wandering souls in the forest. I haven't returned to Blackwood Forest since that day, and I probably never will. But sometimes, late at night, I swear, I can hear the echoes of those thumps, a chilling reminder of the unknown horrors lurking in the shadows of the forest. In the stillness of a moonlit night, the stars hidden by a veil of brooding clouds, I found myself walking alone. The streets were familiar, yet the echo of my footsteps seemed alien. Each tap on the concrete, a drumbeat counting down to an event I could not foresee. The air was unusually still, the typical hum of the city life absent, as if the world held its breath. As I crossed the intersection of Lincoln and Fifth, a glint of movement caught my eye. Someone stood across the street, a silhouette barely discernible, yet unmistakably fixated in my direction. A chill scuttled down my spine, but I dismissed it as paranoia, the remnants of the horror film I'd watched earlier clinging to my senses. With each block, the feeling of unease grew stronger. A glance over my shoulder confirmed my fear. The figure, cloaked in darkness, mirrored my turns, maintaining distance but clearly telling me. My heart raced, the thump loud in my ears as I picked up the pace, thoughts racing to rationalize the situation. Perhaps they were just heading in the same direction, I thought to myself. But the odds seemed slim as I took a random turn down an alley, only to see the figure still behind me, now closer. Panic began to set as I broke into a run, the sound of my pursuer's footsteps, a sinister rhythm behind me. The familiarity of the neighborhood had become a curse. The streets were empty. The night had turned every shadow into a lurking specter. I aimed for the main road, hoping for the sanctuary of lights and people. Upon reaching the boulevard, relief washed over me as I saw a late night diner, its neon sign a beacon of safety. I dashed inside, the warmth of the place a stark contrast to the cold dread outside. Peering through the glass, I searched for my follower, but they had vanished, leaving no trace in the deserted street. The staff eyed me curiously, but I took no mind, asking for a table near the back, away from the windows and doors. I recounted the events to a sympathetic waitress who had offered a free coffee, her kindness a small comfort against the fear. Hours passed, and the night waned. The sun began to cast the first light over the horizon. With trepidation, I decided it was time to leave. The streets, now bathed in the soft glow of the dawn, seemed less threatening. As I approached my home, the sense of safety grew, but it shattered the moment I saw my front door opened slightly, a clear sign of forced entry. I hesitated, then pushed the door, steeling myself for what I might find. Inside, everything seemed untouched until I reached the living room. There, on the coffee table, laid a single photograph. It was of me, taken from a distance on a night much like this one. Scrawled on the back were the words, "I watched because you never noticed." The police found no evidence, no fingerprints, no leads. They said it was likely a stalker, someone who'd fixated on me for reasons unknown. The case remains open, and I've since moved, but the feeling of being watched never truly fades. At night, when the world is quiet, I sometimes wonder if they're still out there, watching, waiting. The story of my stalker, the faceless phantom who followed me home, remains unsolved. A creepy tale of a night when the line between reality and horror was all too thin. I've always enjoyed late night drives, the kind where the road stretches endlessly before you and the world sleeps around you. That's how it started. One ordinary Friday night, I was returning from my friend's place, the clock nearing midnight. I took the less traveled route, a two-lane road winding through dense woods, appreciating the solitude. The night was exceptionally dark, and the moon hiding behind thick clouds, it felt like. I was enjoying a podcast, my mind only half on the road, when I noticed something unusual. The GPS on my phone suddenly lost signal, and the music stopped, or rather, the podcast, replaced by an unsettling static. At first, I shrugged it off as a typical glitch, but then things began to feel off. The darkness seemed denser, the silence outside my car unnaturally heavy. I tried to focus on the road, telling myself it was just my imagination. About an hour into the drive, I saw a figure standing by the roadside. It was a woman, dressed in a tattered white dress, her hair covering her face. She didn't move or try to flag me down. She just stood there, staring. Something about her really made me uncomfortable, and I accelerated, eager to leave her behind. But then things got weirder. Every few miles, I saw the same figure, the same unmoving stance, as if she was following me, appearing and disappearing into the night. My heart began to race, and I felt an icy dread. I tried calling someone, anyone, but my phone showed no service. The road felt endless, the woman's appearances more frequent. At one point, I stopped the car, considering if she needed help, but the overwhelming sense of danger kept me inside. When I looked back, she was gone. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached the familiar parts of the road. The signal returned to my phone and the normal night sounds resumed. I didn't see the woman again. I drove straight home, not stopping for anything. I couldn't shake this experience and did some research the next day. It turned out, years ago, there had been a fatal accident on that road. A woman in a white dress, much like the one I saw. People had reported seeing her, but no one knew who she was. I didn't take that road anymore, especially not at night. The memory of that drive, the woman appearing over and over, haunts me till this day. I still wonder if what I saw was real or was it just a trick of my mind. But one thing's for sure, I'll never forget that night. The night, the road seemed endless. And, of course, I wasn't alone. I had always heard stories about the weird encounters people had through Craigslist, but I never thought I'd have one myself. I needed to buy a used laptop for school, and I found a great deal on Craigslist. The seller, who went by Mike, said he lived nearby and suggested we'd meet at a local cafe. The day of the meeting, I arrived early and sat at a table outside, nervously glancing around. That's when Mike arrived a bit late, carrying a laptop bag. He was an average-looking guy, but there was something off about him, and I couldn't quite put my finger on it. He didn't make much eye contact and seemed eager to finish the transaction quickly. As I inspected the laptop, I noticed it was a bit different from what was described in the ad. When I mentioned this, Mike became visibly agitated. He insisted it was a minor difference and pushed me to complete the purchase. I was starting to feel uneasy, but I needed that laptop, so I handed over the cash. As soon as the money was in his hands, Mike hurried off. I opened the laptop to find it password protected. I tried contacting Mike, but his phone number was no longer in service and his Craigslist ad had been deleted. Feeling anxious and duped, I went to a tech store to see if I could get it unlocked. To my shock, the technician informed me that the laptop had been reported stolen. I had unknowingly bought a stolen property. The police were involved and I had to explain how I ended up with the laptop. Thankfully, they understood and it was an honest mistake. But I was left without a laptop and out of the money I had paid. The experience left me shaken and mistrustful. I realized how easily things could go wrong when dealing with strangers online. It was a creepy reminder of the darker side of seemingly convenient online deals.